10 times over, Keith Richards survived things that should have killed him. He flew backward and blew sparks after being electrocuted on stage in 1965. Everyone believed he had passed away, but that was only the start. He was left immobilized with a needle in his arm after someone used strychnine to poison his heroin. He heard that he was gone when he woke up. Then came the world-shocking episode involving the father's ashes and the unexplained death at his home that the authorities are still unable to solve. At 81, how is he still alive? For decades, the truth about it all was hidden. In the midst of World War, the second Keith Richards was born on December 18, 1943, in Dartford, Kent, a place known as Bomb Alley, because German bombers were continuously flying over to try to strike the adjacent industry. Bombers were flying in the skies that day. Explosions shook the earth, and air raid sirens sounded while his mother was in childbirth. War was all around Keith when he was born. He then claimed that he still got goosebumps every time he heard those same sirens in vintage films, even after decades had passed. His birthplace was a destroyed, devastated, and debris-filled planet, and he somehow inherited that mess. In addition to serving in the military during World War II, his father, Herbert Richards, was a factory worker who suffered severe injuries during the Normandy invasion and never entirely recovered. It was Doris, Keith's mother, who introduced music into the home. She performed jazz records by Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Billie Holiday. There wasn't much in their house, but there was singing. The entire family would join in when the radio played. Keith referred to it as a lot of singers. It was happy and warm, but not everyone was on his side. The concept of Keith becoming serious about music did not sit well with his father. It seemed stupid to him. Keith struggled in school. After struggling with reading, it was determined that he had dyslexia. His parents were embarrassed by his dislike of sports and his tendency to flee from footballs. He frequently skipped class, and in 1959, at the age of 16, he was expelled from Dartford Tech. But before then, an odd thing occurred. He was chosen as one of 3 boy sopranos by Mr. Clark, the school choir director, who recognized something unique in him. Despite his inability to keep up in class, Keith felt that he could do something on stage, and he even sang for Queen Elizabeth II at Westminster Abbey. The 1950s had been difficult for him, but his parents separated in the early 1960s. Keith lived primarily with his mother after the breakup. He became close to his grandfather, Gus Dree, and his boys, who had earlier played in a jazz group named Gus Dree. Gus was able to perform all roles: guitar, piano, saxophone, and even the violin. The nicest thing was that Gus did more than just perform music. He experienced it firsthand. Family sing-alongs and old tunes filled the atmosphere. That was something Keith never forgot. He continued to write thank you messages to Gus and hang them up even after he became famous. Then an event occurred that altered everything. Young Keith climbed on books, cushions, and anything else he could find until he eventually got his hands on a guitar that Gus had put on a high shelf and told him, "If you can reach it, you can have it." He learned to play the Spanish tune Malagina from Gus. Keith never stopped practicing. Like a teddy bear, he slept with the guitar. He became a part of that instrument. He thought about Gus each time he picked it up. "Thanks, Granddad," was the refrain of every song and every stage. In 1961, a train station saw a miraculous event. On platform 2, Keith noticed Mick Jagger, an old-school acquaintance. Mick had 2 rare blues records in his hands, Muddy Waters' Best Of and Chuck Berry's Rocking at the Hops. Keith was taken aback. It was difficult to locate those records. One of the strongest friendships in rock history began at that very time. "Mick is the best R&B singer this side of the Atlantic," Keith wrote in a letter to his aunt. They drank tea together that same day. They formed a band shortly after. The Rolling Stones weren't their first band. Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys were there. At Jagger's house, they rehearsed until the neighbors objected. After that, at Keith's, and finally at Dick Taylor's. In late 1961, they recorded some early tracks and performed Chuck Berry songs. Keith attended Sidcup Art College at this period. It was not to his liking. Instead of teaching art, the college aimed to prepare students for careers in advertising. Keith had no desire to work as a tea maker for advertising executives. He played the guitar in the boys' room most of the time. He had already committed the most of Chuck Berry's guitar solos to memory by that point. Keith had been purchasing American blues records from Chicago's Chess Records. It was the only way to hear authentic blues, but it was sluggish and costly. That music was hardly available in any London outlets. He would spend hours in his room trying to replicate every note, while he played along with the songs. That blues craze wasn't a passing fad. It served as the cornerstone for all of his subsequent endeavors. Keith joined the Boy Scouts when he was still a teenager. He had little interest in camping. The knife they distributed was what he sought. He rose to become the head of Beaver Patrol, his scout organization. He got into a brawl with some Yorkshire scouts, broke his hand pounding a tent pole, and brought bottles of liquor illegally to a large scout gathering. Soon after, he was expelled for striking another trainee. Nevertheless, he claimed that the scouts taught him survival and leadership skills. Keith took up odd jobs, like postman duties, to make ends meet. Just to see blues bands in small bars, he would travel all the way to London. He spotted Brian Jones performing guitar under the alias Elmo Lewis at the Ealing Jazz Club in March 1962. Keith claimed to have never heard a white man play like that when he met pianist Ian Stewart that evening. Something fresh was beginning. In May 1962, Brian Jones advertised in Jazz News that he wanted to form a blues band. Ian Stewart was the first to reply, followed by Jagger and Richards. At the Bricklayers Arms pub, they practiced for the first time in a dusty upstairs room. Later, Keith claimed that something inside of him altered as he ascended those groaning stairs. They had a full lineup by June 1962. Dick Taylor, Stewart, Jones, Richards, Jagger, and drummer Tony Chapman. Jones gave the group the moniker Rolling Stone, a song by Muddy Waters. In July 1962, they played their first show at Oxford Street's Marquee Club. Keith, Mick, and Brian moved into a small, dirty apartment at 102 Edith Grove in Chelsea that summer. There were only 2 rooms and no bathroom. Chip wrappers, beer bottles, and what Keith described as a dreadful brown carpet were all over the floor. They ate very little and frequently subsisted on food that was stolen. The Beatles were appalled by the mess when they reportedly visited the apartment. But they practiced day and night in that dreadful abode. They began writing the music that would transform everything there. Andrew Lug Oldham took over as manager in 1963. Young and driven, he sought to improve their reputation. In order to make Richards sound more pop-friendly, he instructed Keith to remove the S. Keith was known as Keith Richard for a short years. Although it didn't seem like much, it demonstrated the lengths they would go to in order to succeed in the music industry. The Rolling Stones eventually had a break in April 1963. Before Decca Records answered yes, they had been turned down by nearly every label. A month later, they entered Olympic Sound Studios and used a single take to record their debut song, Come On. Just 1 minute and 48 seconds passed. Even though it peaked at number 21 on the UK charts, they only received $19 apiece from the release. Keith Richards, however, detested it. He declined to perform it live because he thought it sounded too much like the Beatles. Andrew Oldham, their manager, was so anxious that he almost lost it. It's crazy that Chuck Berry's first rendition didn't do well in America, because Berry was incarcerated at the time. The Stones simply chose the song because they believed it would be popular. Bill Wyman performed, and Brian Jones provided harmonica and backing vocals, although none of them genuinely liked the song. Then everything altered with a twist. Oldham saw Paul McCartney and John Lennon getting out of a taxi on September 10, 1963. To the Stones' rehearsal, he extended an invitation. In barely 20 minutes, Lennon and McCartney completed writing I Want to Be Your Man in the corner of Delane Lee's studio. It was recorded by the Stones on October 7th and made available on November Honest. It peaked at number 12 and became their first top 20 hit. The Beatles then came out with their own version 3 weeks later. Both bands only ever recorded that one song. The Stones' rendition was the first song ever played on the BBC's Top of the Pops on January Honest, 1964, which makes it even more amazing. It was made memorable by the aggressive cutting edge provided by Brian Jones's slide guitar. They took their maiden flight to America in June 1964. It was a fiasco, according to Bill Wyman. The culture shock was terrible, and they didn't yet have any big songs in the U.S. The racial segregation shocked Keith Richards. He repeatedly requested to see the black area in San Antonio, but authorities refused. Ropes with black on one side and white on the other were used to divide the crowds during performances. They performed for yelling teenagers, seated between cowboy hats and bales of hay, on June 5th in San Bernardino. Dean Martin even made fun of them on television. However, everything changed in Chicago. They encountered murky seas while recording at Chess Studios. Without question, he welcomed them. Songs like Not Fade Away were inspired by the experience. The moment that will define their music then arrived. Richards woke up in the middle of the night on May 7, 1965, in a motel in Clearwater, Florida, took out his tape recorder, and recorded a riff that began, "I can't get no satisfaction." He then went back to sleep. He played the tape again and found 40 minutes of snoring, followed by 2 minutes of music. He had no recollection of recording it. On May 10th, they gave it a try at Chess Studios, but 2 days later, in Hollywood, Richards used a brand new Gibson fuzz pedal to create the final version. By the end of the year, Gibson had run out of fuzz boxes due to the raw sound. On December 3, 1965, however, a horrifying event occurred. Richards unintentionally touched his guitar to an ungrounded microphone stand while performing in Sacramento. A tremendous electric shock rushed through him. He slumped after flying backward in a cloud of blue sparks. Everyone believed he had passed away. The promoter believed it was gunfire because the explosion was so loud. He was scorched, hardly breathing, and semi-conscious when he was taken to the hospital. His rubber-soled hush pups saved him when a doctor looked at him and stated, "They either wake up or they don't." Somehow, he returned to the stage in San Jose the following evening. Get Off My Cloud was released at about the same time. In the US, UK, Canada, and Germany, it peaked at number 1. Richards, however, detested it. He claimed that the manufacturing destroyed it and referred to it as a hurried work. He had desired something more soulful and calmer. It became a follow-up to Satisfaction instead. Throughout the entire song, Charlie Watts' drumming remained consistent and beat. At that time, Richards was already experimenting with open guitar tunings, which would later become popular. Things began to fall apart in 1967. Richards' Redlands home was raided by cops on February 12. Drugs were discovered during a party. Jagger was charged with amphetamine. Richards was charged with permitting the smoking of cannabis within his home. Robert Frazier had 24 pills of heroin. The judge referred to them as scum and filth throughout the June trial. Jagger received a 3-month term along with a $100 fine. Richards received $500 and a year. In Lewis Prison, Richards stayed overnight. Someone at the party, perhaps a man who went by the name Mr. X and disappeared before the trial, had tipped off the authorities. The Stones made a bold attempt that same year. Brian Jones played nearly a dozen instruments on their most hallucinogenic record, Satanic Majesty's Request, but it was anarchy. Oldham gave up. In a nursing facility, Jones was. Not all 5 members were in the studio most of the time. According to Charlie Watts, the acid sessions were a fog. It cost a fortune and took 8 months. The strings were arranged by John Paul Jones. Critics ripped it to pieces when it was released on December 8. They claimed that it was a copy of Sgt. Pepper. Although Richards and Jagger would subsequently make fun of the album, Jones's contributions were particularly noteworthy. It was the last brilliant moment he had before being expelled. At Altamont Speedway, everything fell apart in December 1969. Meredith Hunter, 18, was fatally stabbed by Hell's Angel Alan Passero during the Stones setting. Hunter held a rifle and was dressed in a lime green outfit. He had a meth high. He pulled the gun after security thrashed him. Passero stabbed him 7 times while holding it in one hand. The Gimme Shelter documentary included footage of the murder. To protect the performance, the Hells Angels had been paid $500 in beer. That day, 4 people lost their lives. The 1960s dream was shattered by the bloodshed. Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg fell in love in 1967. However, it took place during a nightmare. He had traveled to Morocco with Brian Jones, and Jones had beaten Anita in a brawl. She never left after Richards saved her, and took her home in his Bentley Blue Lena. His friendship with Jones ended at that point. Jones was discovered dead in his pool 2 years after he was dismissed. For 23 years, Richards and Pallenberg remained together, but it was a tempest of tragedy, jealousy, and heroin. In fact, Richards thought Jagger might be the father of their daughter, Dandelion. Their son Tara passed away from SIDS in 1976. Their relationship was on the verge of disintegrating because of that grief. Next up was Villa Nelcott. In order to avoid Britain's 93% high earner tax, Richards relocated to France in 1971. He paid $20,500 a month to rent a huge mansion. It had once been occupied by Nazi officers. While celebrations raged upstairs, the Stones recorded Exile on Main Street in the basement. Richards worked with Corsican traffickers, known as Les Cowboys, to arrange a supply of heroin. The tumultuous mix of music, drugs, and sex never stopped. But he was overtaken by the pandemonium in 1973. Richards and Pallenberg were accused of possessing and intending to traffic heroin following a raid. He was barred from France for 2 years. Before embarking on a European tour in 1973, Richards sought detoxification at a Swiss clinic. A $5,000 dialysis-style treatment was performed on him, removing toxins from his blood. It was successful, but he made so many jokes about it that people began to claim he had received a full blood transfusion. The story persisted because it suited his unbreakable persona. However, that image broke once more in 1977. In his hotel room, Toronto police discovered 22 grams of heroin. He was charged with trafficking, which carries a maximum sentence of life in prison, because it was sufficient. Fans filled the courtroom during his trial in October 1978. According to the judge, Richards had not stolen to fund his addiction, which is uncommon among addicts. Richards received probation instead of jail time and was required to perform at a blind charity concert. It was a pivotal moment. He was poisoned in the same decade. Someone had added strychnine to his heroin. Everyone around him believed he was dead when he dropped out cold, the needle remaining in his arm. He wasn't. He recalled trying to move, but being immobilized when he heard their voices saying, "He's gone." The mystique around blood transfusions was further fueled by that near-death experience. Richards became paranoid following the 1967 narcotics raid. He believed the police had been tipped off by someone nearby. There were spies following them and maybe bugging their phones, according to the world's newspaper reports. They were aware that George Harrison attended the celebration. It seemed as though Richards' close group was disintegrating. Then the worst happened. While performing in Paris on March 26, 1976, Richards received a call. Tara, his 10-week-old son, had passed away from SIDS. Pallenberg was in Geneva. Richards stayed away from home. He remained and gave a performance. People were incensed. He later said that if he didn't play, he would lose his mind. He acknowledged years later that he still considered Tara once a week. Tragedy struck once more in 1979. Scott Cantrell, 17, was shot in the head and discovered dead in Richards' home. According to reports, he was near Pallenberg. Richards was in Paris at the time. Marlon, his son, was at home. Richards was the owner of the firearm. Despite being detained, Pallenberg was exonerated. Rumors persisted even after it was determined to be a suicide. It was Russian roulette, according to some. Pallenberg wasn't even present, according to others. Before the cops arrived, the housekeeper allegedly had to clear away drug evidence. Finally, Richards married Patty Hansen on his 40th birthday in 1983. Her age was 27. The chaos ended with their wedding. She assisted him in quitting drugs by the late 80s. Alexandra and Theodora were their 2 daughters. According to Richards, she saved his life. "I stopped using heroin in 1978, he claimed. They are still together today, almost 40 years after I quit cocaine in 2006. Richards describes his family as a large extended tribe, and claims they all love each other. He once failed his driving test 3 times, requiring a bodyguard to take it for him. In 1976, after a concert, he crashed his Bentley at 4:00 a.m. with his son Marlon in the back. In 1981, Richards went backstage at the Ritz in New York and picked up Chuck Berry's guitar, and Berry punched him in the eye after he fell asleep, drove off the road, hit a tree, and went through a fence. All survived, but police immediately detained him after finding LSD in his jacket. Berry had kicked him off stage in 1972 and dropped a match down his shirt in 1983. But Richards didn't hold a grudge. He saw it as a badge of honor. In 1988, Keith Richards had finally had enough, and the tension between him and MC Jagger had become so intense that you could cut it with a knife. Richards called it his greatest hit and said he deserved it. Richards chose to forge his own route while Jagger concentrated on his solo career, forming a band that would be anything but typical, and naming them the Expensive Woos, not just a clever moniker. It was a fitting one with Steve Jordan on drums, Waddy Tewell on guitar, Ivan Neville on keys, Charlie Drayton on bass, and Sarah Dash on vocals. But the music paid off, as his first solo album, Talk Is Cheap, went gold. Take It So Hard climbed into the UK top 5. You Don't Move Me cracked the US top 20. Together they entered studios in Montreal, France and Jamaica to create something raw and real. After a 7-year hiatus, the longest in Rolling Stone's history, the band returned to the stage in 1989. The Woos embarked on a 12-city American tour, which included a wild performance at the Hollywood Palladium on December 15, 1988, where Richards joked about being ejected from the same stage during a Chuck Berry show in 1972. Beginning with a covert performance at Toad's Place in Connecticut on August 12th, with only 700 fans paying $31 each. It was thought to be a birthday party, but it was actually the Stones. The full Steel Wheels tour began on August 30 honest at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, where there was a blackout during Shattered, and Jagger had to keep the crowd calm while tech crews frantically worked. In 1998, Keith experienced a different kind of crisis when he climbed up a chair in his private library in an attempt to retrieve a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Study of Anatomy at home in Connecticut, but he slipped. Richards, with songs like Slipping Away, pushed the band back toward their blues roots, and the tour ended up being their biggest yet, more than double the size of anything they did in the 1960s or 70s. The whole European tour was halted after he broke 3 ribs and punctured a lung, and he later joked, "I learned a lot about anatomy, but I didn't find the book." He was 54 when a wall of hardback books fell on him. It was one of those odd, almost poetic accidents that somehow made perfect sense for a man like Keith Richards. With his second solo album, Main Offender, released in October 1992, Richards once again collaborated with Waddy Buchtel and Steve Jordan, recording in California and New York from March to September, this time including reggae into songs like Yap Yap and Eileen. The tour had its magic, particularly the night they played the Town and Country Club in London, which was later released as Winos Live in London '92. The album gave him complete creative freedom, but it didn't perform as well as his debut, peaking at number 45 in the UK, and barely reaching number 99 in the US. Richards would go 23 years before releasing another solo album. In 2003, everything almost fell apart once more, when MC Jagger was beaten. At the age of 58, Richards was overcome with what he called cold rage, and was so distraught about it that he even contemplated leaving the band's 40th anniversary tour. "They knew I'd tell them where to put it," he said of the individuals who organized the award, adding that Queen Elizabeth did not attend the event. Jagger received the title from Prince Charles. However, things had calmed down by 2005. A Larger Bang, which they recorded, peaked at number 2 in the UK and number 3 in the US. In 2006, a year later, Richards experienced another near-death experience. After swimming, he climbed what he described as a twisted low tree while on vacation in Fiji. He slid with moist hands. He smashed his head against the trunk after landing hard. It initially appeared to be a minor injury, possibly a concussion, but the headaches got worse. A serious hematoma was discovered during a brain scan. Dr. Andrew Law, a neurosurgeon, performed surgery after flying more than 1,700 meters. The procedure proceeded smoothly, but it caused a 6-week delay in the European tour. The doctor warned him before the surgery, "I might kill you today." Then April 2007 arrived. Richards snorted his father's ashes. He said nonchalantly to NME magazine, "At the age of 84, Bert Richards passed away in 2002. After 5 years, Heath admitted, I snorted my father." He clarified that he had combined cocaine with part of the ashes. He went on to say, "My dad wouldn't have cared." His manager initially said he was kidding, but Richards revealed the truth in his 2010 memoir. Some ashes had been blown onto a table by a burst of wind. He sniffed it after wiping it with his finger. He remarked, "Ashes to ashes, father to son." When Life was released in October 2010, it blew up. At 564 pages, it was the #1 book on the New York Times bestseller list. It didn't contain itself. He related the violent tales of his bandmates, and talked about surviving a poisoned heroine. While Jagger was still seeing Marianne Faithfull, he wrote about having an affair with her. "While you're missing it, I'm kissing it," he replied. He discussed Anita Pallenberg, girl swapping, and his experience as a high-functioning drug user who treated addiction like a science. In 2012, Richards returned to the stage, despite the onset of arthritis in his fingers. Despite being 68, he refused to stop. The 50th anniversary tour and GR compilation were taking place. He used custom instruments, repositioned his fingers, and modified his guitar playing. He has more than 1,000 guitars in his collection. He remarked, "You never finish school, man." He simply continued to learn. He then shocked everyone once more in 2015, at the age of 71. His first solo album in 23 years, Cross-Eyed Heart, was released. It featured rock, reggae, soul, and blues. A quiet acoustic track that sounded like a fever dream opened it. He was joined on vocals for Illusion by Norah Jones. He even performed a cover of Love Overdue by Gregory Isaac. It seems to have been recorded inside a week, according to critics. Perhaps that's why it felt so genuine. Richards is 81 and still going strong in 2025. He smoked more than 500,000 cigarettes and drank a bottle of Jack every day for decades, until quitting in 2022. He stopped using narcotics. He cut back on his heavy drinking. The doctors don't know how he's still alive, but he does. He contributed to the Hackney Diamonds' first new album in 18 years. They returned to the charts with the song Angry, which peaked at #1 in 20 countries. They are now on tour. However, there is another topic that people avoid discussing. His impact on music extends much beyond the Stones. Jimmy Page once remarked, "Richards was a true devotee of the chess record sound." Despite this, Richard continued to criticize Led Zeppelin, claiming that Bonham's drumming made their music sound uninspired. Page nevertheless contributed lead guitar to the Stones' 1986 hit song, One Hit to the Body. Richards didn't hold back. He pointed out what didn't feel right to him, while simultaneously applauding Page's talent. His style was marked by its honesty. He is credited as a significant influence by guitarists ranging from Slash to Eddie Van Halen. In addition, he has experienced more tragedy than most. Meredith Hunter, then 18, was fatally stabbed at the Altamont Free concert in 1969, only 20 feet away from Richards' position. The band had to use a helicopter to get away. Richards also slept with his smokes lit and survived several house fires. In 1973, one of them set fire to his residence with a thatched roof. Another took place in France during the Exile on Main Street discussions. Next was the band's co-founder, Brian Jones, who passed away at the age of 27 from drowning in 1969. According to Richards, Jones wasn't a very good musician and never wrote a single completed song. Richards and his wife, Patty Hansen, have been living in a colonial mansion in Western Connecticut since 1985. In 1983 they got married. He was given Connecticut's inaugural Governor's Award of Excellence in March 2025. When he was 81 years old, he received it in person from Governor Ned Lamont. In search of a healthier family life, Richards had relocated there from New York. He stated the children grew up beautifully. He reads, writes, and plays the guitar during the day. Through foundations and documentaries, he continues to fight for the blues preservation. In addition, he has residences in the Turks and Caicos Islands and Sussex. But he found tranquility in Connecticut.